All right. Good evening, everybody. We are going to get started in just one moment. There's still a lot of people trickling in, so I'm going to give it about 30 more seconds before we start tonight's presentation. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alyssa Furcus. I'm the Director of Education with the Lake County Forest Preserves. And for those of you who may be familiar with the Forest Preserves, we're located up in northern Illinois, and we make over 31,000 acres of land that we restore, we manage, we preserve, and we teach in. So it's quite a special part of Illinois. I want to give a big thank you to our sponsors for tonight's program, both to USG and to the Preservation Foundation for making tonight's program possible. And before we introduce our speaker, I do want to go over just a few technical tips for Zoom. If you're having any technical difficulties tonight, please utilize that chat box. I'll be monitoring it, making sure everybody can hear and see everything properly. And in addition to that, at the end of this presentation, Dr. Jean Kritsky is going to be able to answer some questions. So as questions come up throughout the presentation, please input those into the question and answer box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the program. And before I introduce both Mark Hurley and Mark Hurley introduces Dr. Kritsky, I do want to launch a quick poll just to make sure that we are capturing tonight's numbers accurately. So I am going to launch this right now. If you could just take one quick second to answer how many people are viewing tonight on your screen. This just helps us have an accurate picture of our attendance numbers. Great, thank you, everybody. And now I am going to pass it on to Mark Hurley. Mark Hurley is one of our environmental educators here at the district, and he has been leading the way for our cicada mania for the forest preserves, and has been planning this immersion for many, many years. And so I want to introduce Mark, and then Mark will introduce our guest speaker tonight. Take it away, Mark.
All right, thanks, Alyssa. So it is my pleasure to introduce our guest tonight. I last worked with him in 2007, 17 years ago, and have kept in contact with him on and off throughout the years, and got a hold of him about a year ago and asked him if he would come on board with us again. And he's been helping us with answering questions and emails and all sorts of things. And he's going to be working at events with us. So it's going to be my pleasure here to introduce Dr. Kritsky in a second. But Alyssa had asked me to come up with a way to introduce him and a narrative, and I didn't know what to say. And Dr. Kritsky's accomplished so much. So I reached out to Gene, and Gene gave me his biography, and he's a humble guy, and I know he's going to be a little embarrassed, but I'm going to read some of his accomplishments, because what he's amassed or achieved over his career is amazing. So bear with me a second. Dr. Gene Kritsky, a native of North Dakota, has been teaching at the college level for over 47 years, lecturing on various subjects including entomology, evolution, zoology, apiculture, general biology, paleobiology, and the history of science. He was named as the Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1996, and was a Fulbright Scholar to Egypt in 1981 and 82. In 2019, he was named a Fellow of the Entomological Society of America. His research has attracted national attention with appearances on the ABC Evening News, CBS Evening News, The Today Show, CBS Sunday Morning, CNN Science News. His work has also been featured in U.S. News and World Report, USA Today, Parade, People, Discover, Scientific American, The New York Times, Washington Post, Science News, and many international publications. He has published over 260 papers and 10 books, including 4 books on periodical cicadas. His recent book, A Tale of Two Broods, was published last January by the Ohio Biological Survey. Known to me and countless others as the cicada guy, I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Gene Kritsky.
Well, thank you, Mark. I could have done better myself, but thank you. And it's a pleasure to emerge again at
Yes.
The Lake Forest Preserves, Lake Forest County Preserves. I visited there 17 years ago, and for the listeners, I actually mapped out parts of Brood 13 34 years ago when Brood 13 emerged in 1990. Did that with my undergraduate professor, Frank Young. So Brood 13 has a close spot in my heart because I've been here now for 3 emergences of this brood, and so that's kind of exciting. I'm going to share my screen and start some slides, and then we'll go from there. So let's see if we can it'll take just a second to get this set, and move this down. So how does this look?
Looks good to me, Gene.
Okay, well, basically
Looks
what
great.
I've asked, thank you, Alyssa. I've been asked to give a little primer on what to expect now that Brood 13 is got ready to make its appearance in Northern Illinois. And let's start. I should point out already we're getting cicada safari reports of adults emerging in the greater Chicago area. That's mostly because cities tend to be a heat zone, if you will. They're hotter than the wooded areas. And so we're probably sitting around, I know we have well more than a couple of hundred people that reported cicadas, but the number of adults are one here, one there. The full main emergence hasn't yet started, but there are people that are seeing the adults starting to emerge. So without further ado, let's talk what's going to be happening. This year is special because we have 2 broods emerging in Illinois, but we're going to focus on Brood 13. Brood 13 is shown here on the map on the left with the blue dots. It is a 17-year cicada. We also have an emergence this year of Brood 19. That's a 13-year cicada. And if you if you're not familiar with the brood designation, these brood numbers were created in 1893 by Charles Marlett. And that's because we had a lot of confusion as to keeping track of which brood was emerging where. There were competing methods, and he decided to propose a system that make it a little easier. So he felt it started with every cicada that brood that emerged in 1893, that was going to be called Brood 1. If they emerged in 1894, that's Brood 2, and so on. And numbers 1 through 17 are reserved for 17-year cicadas. For 13-year cicadas, any 13-year cicada that emerged in 1893, that was Brood 18, and numbers 18 through 30 were saved for 13-year cicadas. So by just saying Brood 13, you already know that is a 17-year cicada. It turns out there are 12 distinct broods of 17-year cicadas and 3 distinct broods of 13-year cicadas. And what makes this year sort of special is the dual emergence of 2 broods in 1 year. But the last time these 2 specific broods emerged together was in 1803 when Thomas Jefferson was president. Now, in and of itself, dual emergences are not rare. Since there's 12 17-year broods and 3 13-year broods, 3 times 12 is 36. So over a 200 or so period of time, you're going to have at least 30 of these dual emergences. But why there's a lot of interest this year is because, as you can see on these maps, in central Illinois, there's the possibility of contact between the 2 broods. Now, if you're here in northern Illinois, don't feel bad that the big zone of this thing is happening, because it turns out that's not going to be an area of significant numbers of cicadas. It turns out that overlap is going to be where Brood 13 is near the end of its southern distribution, where numbers are not as great. And by conversely, Brood 19 will be at its northern distribution, where numbers aren't as great. But here's the kicker: you cannot tell the broods apart. So if you're go to the overlap zone, you'll find cicadas, but you will not be able to tell which one's brood 13 or 19. The way we'll have to verify this is to get careful maps this year and then come back 13 years from now to see where brood 19 emerged. And that's a distinct, definitive brood 19 site. Then come back 4 years later and see where brood 13 emerges. And if those overlap, then we know that we had a dual emergence in this given area. So it's not something that we should be worried about, that we're not getting a chance to see that overlap. Now, what's going to happen? Many of you may have seen this if you had one or two of these things that emerge already. But when the soil temperature reaches 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and I have found in my 50 years of working on these things that after a nice soaking rain, that really causes the immature cicadas to start emerging. And here is one that just popped out of the ground, and I was able to get still all dusty and what have you, as it tries to make its way to a tree, to start climbing up the tree, to start the transition from an immature 5th instar periodical cicada until into the adult. What they do, and here's a composite. You'll see all these, the one at the upper left corner, that's a nymph that's climbing up a tree. You'll notice behind the head, where just behind the red eyes, there's a black spot. When the cicadas develop, as they develop those two black spots, that's usually the day or the before or the day of their emergence. So they climb up this tree, they lock their little tarsal claws in the tree, and you'll see in the second picture on the top row, the nymphal skin is beginning to split open, and there's a white patch. That's the white adult cicada starting its process of emerging out of its immature shell. The third picture on the top on the far right shows that it's pulled itself almost out entirely of the nymphal skin. And the left picture in the middle shows it hanging upside down, held only in place by just the tension of that little opening it caused when it split out, the nymphal skin split, hanging upside down. It waits a few minutes as the process of hardening of the exoskeleton occurs to give it a good muscle attachment points, so that when it contracts its muscle, it doesn't pull in, but actually was able to get some lever action to help free its abdomen. And you see on the middle right photograph, it's now grabbing a hold of its nymphal skin, and it will wriggle its abdomen free. As you see on the bottom far left picture, it is now free, but the wings are all shriveled up. And what it will do over the next few minutes is pump fluids through the wing veins, expanding the wings. And you'll see on the bottom row, second from the right, that white cicada with red eyes, those two black patches, and the wings held tent-like over the back. That whole process, from what we saw at the beginning with the nymph crawling out of the ground and getting to here, that's going to take about 90 minutes. It'll take another 90 minutes or so for the cicada to turn entirely black, as you see in the bottom right-hand photograph, where the exoskeleton has darkened and is continuing its hardening of its exoskeleton. Now, at this point, it's not ready to fly. It's not ready to sing. What it will usually do is these cicadas will walk up to the higher parts of the tree. It will continue its sclerotization of the exoskeleton and tanning, and it will not start singing for 5 days. So if you walk out in your yard and you see all these empty shells, and you're waiting for the calls, it'll be quiet the next day. It'll be quiet the day after that, but you'll slowly start hearing some weak chorusing after 5 days. And then as more cicadas emerge and emerge and emerge over the course of the next 2 weeks, that will get the chorusing louder and louder for the cicada emergence. Eventually, you're going to find your shrubbery, your trees covered with these cicadas. Hank Dybus, who was a curator at the Field Museum and a good friend of mine before he passed, did a census in Chicago in the 1950s, actually specifically in 56. And he went out and did census counts of the holes in the ground, and was able to determine how many cicadas are coming up. And it turned out it extrapolated to 1.5 million per acre under trees. This is acreage under a tree. They're not going to, if you have a golf course lined with trees, they're not going to come up in the middle of the golf course. They will come up under the trees that line the golf course. But and I've done some similar surveys in suburban Cincinnati, and I didn't get the same number that Divus got, I only got about 750,000 bugs per acre. Even though it's not as great, that's still a lot of bugs. And so they'll start gathering, and as more and more emerge, more and more we'll start seeing as time goes by. So this whole emergence process takes about a full 2 weeks for the first ones to come out and the last ones to come out. And so the entire emergence will take about 6 full weeks once you start seeing adults coming out to when the last adult dies and stops singing and dies. And they get rather rather numerous on various trees. This is a photograph I took of cicadas. Now, this is an interesting area. No cicadas emerged any of these trees. It was from a housing development that where in the middle 90s, the developers came in and clear cut all the trees. Not a single cicada emerged under any of the trees that in the subsequent development, but they flew in from surrounding areas from between 1/4 mile to 3/4 of a mile away. They flew in and they laid eggs. And this was back in 2004, and I went back in 2021, and sure enough, cicadas now are emerging in this development. It took a generation for that to for them to disperse in and reestablish themselves, but they did that just the same. And eventually, over time, they'll start accumulating in the trees, and you'll start hearing them. Most of the calls you're hearing are Cicada cassini. It's where that shimmering sound, you know, that sound. And you might see some cicadas flying around, and it gets loud and drops and loud and drops. That's because if a male is unsuccessful in attracting a female after a couple of times of singing, he will fly to another branch or another tree to see if he's able to attract a mate at that time. Now, we have 7 different species of periodical cicadas. There are 3 species that are going to emerging here in the greater Chicago area. They're the 17-year cicadas. And that's what you see on the left photograph. You're seeing the top view and the bottom. As you can see, there's 1 large species and 2 smaller species. The 2 smaller species are almost equal in size. You really can't tell their difference by looking at it from the top, but you can if you look at the underside. So if it's a large species like you see with all those orange bands on the underside of the abdomen, that's Cicada septendecim. In the middle, you see the smaller cicada. It's entirely black on the underside. That's Cicada cassini, and the one on the far right in the lower photograph of the 17-year cicadas, that's Cicada septendecula. That's the rarer of the 3. If you didn't have the larger species, probably 90% of the time you're going to have the smaller Cicada cassini. Now, if you were to drive south of Springfield, you would be in Brood 19 area, and they have 4 species of 13-year cicadas, of which not all 4 will emerge in the same place, but some locations further south will have the larger tridecim, and the more northern ones will have the larger neotridecim. So again, looking at it from the top, there's 2 large, 2 small, and if you look at the underside, of the 13-year forms, the far lower left is Cicada neotridecim, and if you look at that coloration compared to septendecim in the 17-year cicadas, they're very similar because genetically they are identical, except for their life cycle. Next to them is tridecim with much more orange, but these colors are variable, and we're seeing some neotridecims that look a lot like tridecim, and we're seeing a lot of tridecim look like neotridecim. So it's best if you can find the distribution map and know where you're collecting these. There's Cicada tridecassini, which looks just like cassini in the 17-year form, and Cicada tridecula, which looks just like the septendecula. Up here, we'll just have the 3 17-year cicada species emerging. As they emerge, their carcasses and their shells start to accumulate on the ground. The spent shells, you can see there's lots of them. There's no reason to worry about these and try to remove them. They will eventually break up and decay. Even if you have a lot of dead cicadas accumulating and that smell sometimes seems bothersome, there's no reason to try to get rid of them because the decay of these cicada cicadas and the nymphs that don't make it, that leads to, as they decay, all their nutrients go into the soil around the tree and help sustain the tree for the next 17 years. So it is a scent memory, the smell of these rotting cicadas, but it won't last forever, and it's good for the tree. But as you'll see here, here's a tree that is loaded with these cicadas all over the place. They don't feed a lot, but they do have to stay hydrated. And so you'll find sometimes these cicadas will have a little wet spot around them where they've been feeding on the xylem tissue. Sometimes they bring in so much fluid, they literally squirt that fluid out. I've heard some of the media about that. That is a real thing. I've experienced it many times. But you're seeing scenes like this will be lots and lots of cicadas, and the calling can get quite loud. Indeed, I measured the calling at this particular location had 90 decibels, and to put that in perspective, that's much louder than the jets flying into O'Hare Airport. Of course, the purpose of gathering the trees and the male singing is to attract a mate. Males are able to sing a call. Their females are silent. They don't have the sound-making structure. However, the female does respond by flicking her wings. And so as the male goes through his call, at a certain point towards the end, she'll flick her wings to give evidence of her interest in possible mating. He'll go into another mating call, then a second mating call, and a third mating call as mating begins. And mating looks like what you see here in the upper left-hand corner. Sometimes they're tails you see here. Sometimes they'll be in a V-shape pattern. But these cicadas will stay locked in copula for several minutes. I've seen as long as 45 minutes for the transfer of the sperm from the male to the female. And that's because the female has over 500, on average, about 500 eggs that she needs to fertilize. And that and 85% of the males only mate once. And so he will transfer all the sperm that he has to his to the female, and she's got a special structure inside called the spermatheca that nurtures and keeps it alive. And as those 500 eggs pass down her oviduct, they're automatically fertilized, and she lays them on the underside of the tree branches towards the end of the branches. That's what you're seeing at the in the bottom right picture. You can actually see the ovipositor of the female puncturing the tree here, so while this is going on, she'll be pumping in eggs, laying between 20 and 40 in a single egg nest, and then she'll move another ½ inch down and do it again until she exhausts her supply of eggs. And here is the female that's ovipositor. You can see the ovipositor right here, and you can hear the chorus of the cicadas around her. You're hearing two species here. That sort of higher pitched tone is, of course, the septendecim, and that sort of shimmering sound, if you will, is Gasseni. So this is what the egg nests look like. The female will, her egg laying structure called an ovipositor will saw into literally saw into the branch and cut into it, and she'll deposit eggs. Each of these areas right here, this is a single egg nest. There'll be between 20 and 40 eggs in pairs. Here, she'll move down, lay another batch here, move down. And she does this until she either runs out of twig or runs out of eggs. If she runs out of twigs, she'll fly to another branch and continue doing that until she exhausts her supply of eggs. So after this egg laying is not necessarily harmful for the tree, but it does result in what we call flagging. Here is a tree that was heavily oviposited. You'll notice all those brown leaves. This may look ugly, but they're not eating them. So what happened is in the process of tearing up the twig tissue, and I'll go back to this slide to show you where it tore up this tissue. Sometimes that causes the xylem to not be able to flow enough water to the end of the branch, causing the leaves to wilt. In some cases, the branch can even break and snap and hang there. We call that flagging, and it looks terrible, but it turns out it's like a natural pruning. And next year, when the trees set their new leaves and flowers, they'll have actually a larger flower set than they would have this year. So it's beneficial. About 3 weeks into the emergence, you might start seeing some cicadas with the very tip of their abdomen with this white mass. Sometimes the abdomen actually falls off completely, like you can see here in the middle cicada. This is the fungal infection that they get, and it starts to manifest itself towards the third to the fourth week of the emergence. Since the fourth week, since the first one started coming out, it changes the behavior of males. If a male is infected, he will flick his wings like he's a female to attract an uninfected male to come in contact. So there's been a lot of interest in the media about this fungus. It tends to hypersexualize the males, so they respond to other male calls. But that's a way of, that's not necessarily great for the cicada, but it's a way for the fungus to spread to other insects. Now the eggs in the trees. Let's go back to the egg laying. The eggs will be in the trees for about 6 to 10 weeks. And after about 6 to 10 weeks from their being laid, and why there's that range there is because there's that 2-week lag for all the cicadas to come out. So you'll start seeing these things dropping after, or hatching, I should say, after 6 to 10 weeks. I set up a little collection system, and I collected 1 hour old periodical cicada nymphs, and I videotaped them. These are about little over between 2 and 3 millimeters long, and here they are, 1 hour old, and they're awfully cute when they're small, aren't they? And so as an experiment, I wanted to see how fast they get underground. The female cicada lays her eggs on the underside of the branch. So when the cicada nymphs crawl out of the egg nest, they literally fall straight to the ground. And I've done this. I've taken these, if I took these the nymphs out to the outside, dumped them under a tree that had healed egg nests, so I knew cicadas were doing well there. And within 30 seconds, most of them were gone. Definitely a minute afterwards, all of them were out of sight. And that's because these nymphs are extremely vulnerable to ants, spiders, and beetles at this stage. And so I've had people tell me they were actually, with the sun was at the right angle, they could see them dropping from the tree branches to the ground. But when they went to look for them, they couldn't find them. That's because these guys it's instinctive for them to get underground as much and as fast as possible. And they feed on grass roots for the next several weeks after they enter the ground, the soil. And then by New Year's Day, they will be 8 to 12 inches below the ground, sucking on a tree root. And that's where they'll be for the next 17 years. And if you look at your trees where these things have emerged, that feeding doesn't harm the tree at all. In fact, you wouldn't be able to tell by just looking at a tree that there were cicadas feeding on it that was taking nutrients away. That doesn't harm the tree in the slightest. So of course the big excitement here is the potential of an overlap. And this is a map that was produced by my PhD advisor, Dr. Louis Stannard. He published in 1974 the Periodical Cicadas of Illinois, published by the Illinois Natural History Survey. The map on the far left is a composite map of all the broods that we have in Illinois. In the middle is the map for brood 13, and on the far right is the map for brood 19. And you can see that there is a possibility of overlap, especially in Sangamon County. But as I mentioned earlier, we're not expecting double the cicadas there. In fact, it might even be fewer cicadas you'll find in some of the suburban yards in Chicago. But what you can do, if you really want to go on a cicada jaunt, is you can start in Peoria. Drive down to Peoria. You can see brood 13 cicadas if you don't already have them in your yard. Drive 2 hours south of Peoria into south of Springfield, and you'll see brood 19 cicadas. And that's where you'll find Neotrudescum. So you could see 6 of the 7 species in one day, which is something that's really quite rare indeed. So by the end of June and early July, depending on when the cicadas start emerging, that they will, and especially as we get into late June, the loudness of the calls declines. They slowly get quieter and quieter. Back in 2021, when I had brood 10 emerge in Illinois, I heard the last single male cassini singing on the 2nd day of July, calling for a mate, and there was no more mate to be found. And once that last cicada stop singing, you will not have brood 13 cicadas again until 2041, when they will reemerge in northern Illinois. Now, if you want to help us, you could get involved with our Cicada Safari project. Cicada Safari is a free app for the iPhone and Androids. You can find it on the Apple App Store or the Google Play. It's very simple to use. You download the app. We ask for your email because I will sometimes email people who report cicadas, especially if it's in an area that we never had reports before. And so you go out, you sign up, you'll see here on the right, that's the startup screen. There's a leaderboard for whoever turned in the most photographs, and you touch these photographs, and behind this is a story. And I update what's going on with the cicadas periodically. And so if you go to the screen, you'll see a headline. You can click behind it and see what's going on. The big news right now is cicadas are screaming in Mount Vernon. Brood 19 is singing like crazy. We're seeing brood 19 cicadas beginning to, they started emerging 5 days ago in Charleston, I'm sorry. And we just had some emergence of a few around Champaign-Urbana. We've got just a slight light emergence beginning around Springfield. A few brood 13 cicadas have now emerged in Peoria, but the big emergence of brood 13 hasn't apparently started yet. So what you do is you go out on a cicada safari, you look for cicadas, and there's even a story on the app to tell you how to take a good photograph. Go out, as long as your location services are turned on, your longitude, your latitude, GPS for a droid, your location services for the iPhone, take a photograph, and at the bottom of the app, there's a little paper airplane icon. Touch that, it sends it to our servers where they're checked to make sure that they are indeed periodical cicadas. And if they are, it goes onto a live map. So if you want to know where you can go to find adult cicadas, get Cicada Safari, click on the map icon down here on the bottom, and you can actually go zero in on where the cicadas have been reported in the greater Chicago area and go right down to the street level and go find some cicadas. Or you may be lucky enough to have them in your own backyard. So if you want to learn more about this, you can go to cicadasafari.org. That's the website that supports the app. In addition to talking about what's going on with the emergence, the double emergence, there are a whole series of FAQs for periodical cicadas. There's also a lot of activities for kids. Cicadas, the color, make a cicada diorama. You can even make a little model cicada out of a toilet paper roll, and there's instructions on how to do that as well. And of course, my book, A Tale of Two Broods, the 2024 Emergence of Periodical Cicada Broods 13 and 19 is available on Amazon as an ebook and as a paperback. And you can learn more about the broods. I even go back and talk about every single brood from emergence from 1803 to the present for both broods 13 and 19. So with that, Mark, I'm ready to entertain some questions.
Yeah, before I get to the Q&A, that's a perfect photo you have up right now because that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. There are some cicadas that are emerging in the west suburbs right now, and a little bit in our area here in Deerfield and Highland Park. And our first one at Ryerson Woods was seen on Sunday, and then on Monday, I have to admit I was a bit jealous. I didn't get the first one, and I went out looking myself and just happened upon one. Over at those folks familiar with Ryerson Woods, there's probably a lot of people on tonight that are at the old Ryerson cabin. The structure is still there, but the bulk of the cabin is gone, and that ground there heats up. It's pretty sunny. There's cement there, and I found mine on the chimney of the old Ryerson cabin that still exists.
Yeah.
But back over there today, leading a bird walk, and at the same spot found a cicada in the teneral stage here, the white stage that you have up. And I wanted to ask you, Gene, because I get this a lot, and this is one of the first things that people see. So after these emerge out of their exoskeleton, they're going to see those two black spots. And I've heard 3 reasons they have 2 black spots. You care to address that? We have talked about this.
The black spots develop just before they emerge from the ground. In fact, for people who submitted photographs to Cicada Safari before they emerged, back in March. Some people were digging these up in their gardens and yards. They had red eyes. They developed the red eyes in the November before the year they emerged. So we know they're going to emerge, but they don't actually come out of the ground until these black dots occur. And the leading idea behind this is that, the dark coloration occurs simultaneously when the exoskeleton starts to harden. And for the muscles to work properly, to get the adult out of the shell, these contractions have to have something that's stable for them to be able to pull their way out. And that may be why we have these more heavily sclerotized patches.
And the other maybe, I guess, theory is that they could be eye spots, right?
That some people have suggested that, although no one has zeroed in on these eye spots and done research to see if it's enough to scare away a potential
Right.
predator like a bird
Right.
or a chipmunk
Right.
or what have you.
So with that said, and we'll turn it over to Alyssa. On the bird walk this morning, one of the folks actually saw a flicker woodpecker with the tenoral stage in its
Oh,
beak.
cool.
So it didn't scare off that flicker.
Sure. So you go back to the view of me, or you want me to stay on cicadas on screen?
Alyssa, what do you think?
Yeah, let's go back to Eugene.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so too.
Perfect. All right, we've got lots of questions. So I'm just going to dive on in and see how many we can answer here.
Okay.
The first one is, how long have periodical cicadas been alive, and why are they only in North America?
Well, the periodical cicada, the genus Cicada, as with the genetic or protein clock or the genetic clock, go back about 3.95 million years. And that's when they split into the large and small species. And then subsequent evolution of the periodical cicada species and the broods occurred in part because, their life cycle evolved in part because of the ice ages. The leading ideas right now that we're looking at is that the gradual cooling before the ice sheet moved south selected for longer life cycles. And there might have been, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, maybe even 18 different year patterns at that time. But by being underground longer, it allowed them to get over to survive these increasingly cooler temperatures. Once the ice sheet started to retreat, that stopped the selection for the long life cycle, but did favor selection for synchronized emergence of the different species, but also to favor the evolution of a prime number life cycle. Because one of the things we needed that the cicadas have done is they've evolved a tendency to have three species come out simultaneously, and collectively they form these massive numbers of cicadas. And to do that, selection favored the less likelihood of hybrids occurring between cicadas that might have come out. Let's say they were 14 years, but they had some errors. They came out after 15 and other 15s and what have you. So by getting rid of these intermediate life cycles and then settling on a prime number life cycle, it stopped any kind of hybridization and large numbers coming out in between years. But then it also increased the number of cicadas in the population to overwhelm and satiate the predators. And lastly, the long prime number life cycle made it impossible for predators and parasitoids and other insects to evolve a life cycle to take advantage of periodical cicadas, because there's no intermediate way to get from 1 to 17. And so those are the ideas we're working on right now for the evolution of these life cycles.
So interesting. Thank you. Another question: why are some areas very heavily populated with cicadas, but only one county over or a town over, there's nothing at all?
The distribution of periodical cicadas is dependent in part on the abundance of trees. They need trees to reproduce, and we have seen significant deforestation for agriculture. We've also seen deforestation for urban development. And if you start cutting into the forest, and these clusters of trees get smaller and smaller and smaller in that given location, you might not have enough cicadas come out to overwhelm the predators so they can survive to reproduce. And so that very likely is what may have happened in some of the counties that we've been looking at. Northern Indiana used to have cicadas in every county of the state for brood 10. And now the northern half of the state, several counties don't have cicadas anymore, and some have very few, very widely scattered emergence areas where there's still a cluster of trees to produce enough cicadas to overwhelm the local predators.
If I could, you could even narrow that down to Lake County in our county. So in the southern portion along the Des Plaines and along the lake, we had the original forest, the big forest, and we're full of cicadas. But as you go north and work your way to the west, they don't occur in Illinois Beach State Park and the sandy areas up there that go across the west. They weren't in the prairie portions of Lake County, not so much in the oak savannas either. And there's certainly not a wetland animal. So it can really vary in just in our county alone, all counties, I suppose.
And Jean, you mentioned trees, that, trees are necessary. That one of the questions is, what trees do cicadas prefer to lay their eggs in? And do they avoid particular trees? An example that they asked was, like, will they lay in crabapple trees, or is the bark or wood just too dense?
Well, cicadas have been documented to lay their eggs in over 200 species of woody plants.
Oh, wow.
Now, the 3 species, before we started urbanization and human development, tended to find septendecimum like to have upland areas with a lot of oaks and things like that. Areas that were along a floodplain favored cassini, and deculus, for the species Deculus, seemed to like the edge effects. However, when a female cicada is going to lay her eggs, what is she looking for? She's looking for a mature tree in full sunlight, surrounded by low vegetation. And so as we've urbanized our world and we've created parks and cemeteries and arboreta and preserves, we've let some of these areas, we've mowed the grass, so we've created this cicada habitat, and all 3 species will go into some of the into the same trees. As far as I've done some egg hatch rate counts and found that if they get into maples and oaks and crabapples, apples, pear, and what have you, you'll have about 94% of 17-year cicada eggs survive and hatch. If, however, I've seen them lay eggs in white pine, and the terpenes in the sap in pine trees kills about half of the cicada eggs. So they're certainly not making a conscious decision going, when they laid their eggs in a white pine, they didn't know that, these are bugs. They didn't know that it would be detrimental to their offspring. But they're pretty ubiquitous as far as the number of trees that like to lay their eggs in.
And Jean, each female lays about 600 eggs?
I actually had an undergraduate student. We looked at females from 3 different broods, and we kept counting until we reached the totals were like 30,000 for the sample. And it turns out the average cicada is the female has just over 500 eggs. The range is 400 to 600. The lower end is like 400 and change, and the others just barely reaching 600. But 500 is a good general number, and they have a 1-to-1 sex ratio. So imagine you're in your yard, you've got all these cicadas like I have behind me here, and half of them are female, and each one of those is going to lay 500 eggs. Just this little sample behind me, that's going to be well into the thousands of potential cicadas for the next emergence.
Wow. And that kind of goes into the next question. So obviously male cicadas, they sing to attract a mate. Now, do they breed more than once, or do they breed with just one female one time?
Observational data suggests that the males, that 85% of the males will mate once. Great. 10% will mate twice, and 5% will mate 3 times. And that's beneficial for the species, because when they start to emerge, more males will emerge than females for the first 3 days in particular. Then for the next 3 to 4 days, it's almost a 50-50 ratio. And then after that first week, we see slightly more females emerging than males. And so if we no longer have a 1-to-1 hatch rate, we need males to move to mate more than once for that reproductive potential to be achieved.
Do pesticides that are used to treat the emerald ash borer, do they impact the cicadas?
That's a very good question. I have seen cicadas emerge under ash. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. I have ash trees in the house that my wife and live in, and some of those trees have been treated with the injection of pesticide. Under the trees that were injected, we didn't have any cicadas emerge because, again, from under those trees. However, female cicadas flew into the ash trees and they laid eggs in that petiole, that long green stem with all the little leaves that you see. They were laying eggs in that portion. And as soon as they did, those leaves dropped.
Mm.
And so whether that's because the tree was treated or not, I'm not entirely certain, but that action certainly did not help the success of those cicada offsprings.
Could you talk a little bit more about the overlap where the 13 and 17-year cicadas, where are the best places to see them, and do they mate? Will the different broods mate?
Well,
And when would they come out, in 13 or 17 or 15 years?
well, the overlap zone is very narrow indeed. It may be just a few miles wide. It's at the extreme southern end, as I mentioned earlier, at the extreme southern end of brood 13 and at the extreme northern end of brood 19. And what's really crazy is that the 13-year cicadas come out before the 17-year cicadas. So already we've got 13-year cicadas in big numbers in Jacksonville, Illinois. That's just the same latitude as Springfield. But you go 30 miles, 40 miles north, and you have hardly any 13-year cicadas out. And that'd be close to the overlap zone. So if that stays true, then there's going to be no overlap. Genetics, our genetic analyses suggest that they could certainly overlap, hybridize if given the opportunity. Will that produce a change? There have been a number of papers, including one that I co-authored as well back in the 80s, that we found some data that suggested that the 13-year life cycle was a recessive allele gene. The 17-year was dominant. Other people have published just the reverse, that the 13-year was dominant. And we thought that would play a role in brood formation. But the confirmation of that in cicada populations, we had one example in Piatt County, Illinois, where that looked like that happened. And it resulted in a new pocket of brood 23, 13-year cicadas. But subsequent areas where we didn't expect to find a unrecognized brood of brood 22, 13-year cicadas in Southwest Ohio and Northern Kentucky. And for that to have happened, we needed to have by this genetic model, we needed to have a pocket of 13-year cicadas for them to mate with. That wasn't present. So we're still looking for the answer on that one.
Very interesting. I've been getting a lot of questions about stragglers. Can you elaborate a little bit more on stragglers, and should we expect them?
Well, stragglers are what we call cicadas that come out off cycle. I've spent most of my career studying straggler cicadas because maps I had created with a lot of historical data suggested that there could be changes in broods popping up once in a while. And what we've had happen is we know that, as I mentioned, periodical cicadas come out when the soil temperature is 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The gradual warming that we're seeing, there are predictions that would suggest that this should create or favor the formation of more stragglers, because what that would do is it could trick the trees into having more than one fluid flow in a given calendar year. And if that would happen, that would cause some cicadas, especially 17-year cicadas, to come out 4 years early. And that happened in Chicago in 2020. You had large numbers of cicadas come out in 2020, enough to satiate predators. They sang, they mated, they laid eggs, and those eggs hatched. And that is the first step in forming a new brood. Now, that's not the first time this happened that's been observed. We also observed it in Cincinnati in the year 2000 when we had a massive 4-year acceleration of brood 10 cicadas. The question was, do they stay 13 or do they come out 17? So what do you think we need to do to figure that out? We wait. So we waited 13 years and a few hundred cicadas came out, but not enough to survive predation. 4 years later, tens of thousands of cicadas came out after 17 years, probably also joined by additional accelerating stragglers as well. But we now have seen evidence that these off-cycle emergences can form reproducing populations, which would be a new brood because the brood number is based on what year they come out. So we've actually observed the formation of a new brood 6 population in Southwest Ohio in the last 20, I should say 34 years. And
So
so
if I could, go ahead.
you'll expect if that happens in Chicago, within not this right in 2041, 4 years before 2041, you might have more accelerated cicadas. If that's the case, and this happens again in Chicago, you'll have a new formation of a brood 9 cicadas in northern Illinois.
In 2037. And I witnessed that, and for those that know the area, and there's people from all over the country on with us tonight, but folks that are local, they were in the neighborhoods of Wilmette, and the Winnetka area and extreme south east corner of our county, Lake County. That's the ones you're referring to.
Yep.
We have a lot of more questions, so I'm going to keep going until.
If I can, Alyssa.
Yes.
The thing about these accelerations is interesting, and we're looking at climate as the trigger, because when these brood 10 cicadas came out early in 2017, they came out early not only in Cincinnati, but in Baltimore, in Washington, in parts of Philadelphia, in Indianapolis, in Louisville. So the cause of this acceleration is not local, it's continental. And over the last 40 years of emergencies, broods 2, 5, 10, 13, and 19, I missed 14 in there as well, 14 and 19, have had 4-year accelerations. We've got some evidence of some small pockets of brood 23 accelerating 4 years early this year. And the thing about that is that those are 13-year cicadas coming out after 9 years. That's kind of interesting.
Alyssa, before you get going on the next one, I mean, we will have some stragglers coming out next year at this time.
Yeah, it's very common to have cicadas come out 1 year early and 1 year late. But they mostly get eaten.
All right. Thank you. That was very interesting. Jean, do cicadas sing all day and all night, or do they sing just during the daytime?
They tend to start revving up around 10 a.m. in the morning, and they'll go until just around sundown. Depending on how hot it was, it might extend a few minutes into the evening hours. But they don't sing at night because that makes them very vulnerable to nocturnal predators.
Great.
Now,
What about
the other singers you might see here tonight are like katydids and crickets and things like that. They sing into the night.
what about cicada killers? Do they at all affect these periodical cicadas?
One of the things, as I mentioned with the prime number life cycle, generally the cicada killer wasps emerge from the ground in July after all the periodical cicadas have already died. They're triggered to come out with the annual cicadas. These are the camouflage larger cicadas that we get every year. You'll hear them in the trees going bzz, bzz, bzz. And these wasps, which look enormous, they're rather docile. You have to get in their face to get stung. I wouldn't necessarily try to pick one up and play with it, but so don't do that at home. But they are out to try to find an adult cicada. They sting it, they paralyze it, and they bury it in the sand along with an egg to nourish their young after the egg hatches. But no, they tend not to affect or impact the periodical cicadas at all.
I have a question from Isa, who's age 9. She put her age there, so I had to share. She's listening tonight, and she wants to know why cicadas mostly only fly and never walk.
Well, they can walk short distances, and that's a wonderful question, by the way. And they're clumsy flyers. They don't, they sort of mumble around, it seems like, and as Marco mentioned to me a few minutes before we started, they're easily picked off in flight by birds. So But they will walk. I've seen cicada. Well, for example, when a male cicada is singing for a female, and if it hears the flick of the wings, it'll walk towards it. And if you've never seen that, if you go to the YouTube and look up the BBC David Attenborough periodical cicadas, there's a video clip of him pretending to be a female by snapping after the call. He snaps his fingers and the male walks towards him. Then he snaps his fingers behind the male and the male turns around and walks towards us. They will walk on tree branches and what have you. And I've seen them walk in the soil or on grass, but they'll tend to fly if they can. But once they're in the tree and they have to start mating, they will walk short distances at that time.
Why do they have red eyes? Any particular reason?
Well, the real answer is the better to see you with, my dear.
Could you talk about the knock-on environmental effects of all the cicadas, like things like birds having more clutches and oaks having, just talk a little bit about the impacts.
Certainly. Well, periodical cicadas are unique and endemic to the eastern deciduous forests of North America. And when they emerge, it is a pulse of biomass that's quite beneficial to the ecosystem. So when they come into those holes in the ground that are about the size and diameter of your little finger, those holes, especially if you've got a lot of clay in your soil, as the summer heats up, it bakes that soil, it gets really hard. And so during a summer rain, a lot of that rainwater just runs off the surface. But if there are holes from cicadas, some of that water is going to go right down to the tree roots, and that's beneficial for the tree. When the adult cicadas emerge from their nymphal shell and start flying around, as you mentioned, Alyssa, they are prey for all sorts of animals: dogs, cats, raccoons, squirrels, chipmunks. I've seen deer eat these. I've seen a video of an owl during the day landing on the ground, hopping around, picking up cicada nymphs as they're trying to. This is in the morning as they're trying to find an upright surface to shed their skin. Even turtles and snakes are known to eat these, and that's very good for the predator. As you mentioned, their clutches will be larger. We've had reports from health departments in urban areas where the cicadas were plentiful that the number of rats increased because there's a greater biomass of food for them to survive. That may not be beneficial for us, but it is for the rat. So that's useful. And if you had instances where there might have been some population decline in a particular group of birds, for example, this can help them to replenish their population numbers of cicada emergence. When the female cicada, as I mentioned earlier, lays their eggs in the end of tree branches, that they turn brown. Not all of them, but some of them do. That's like a natural pruning. That leads to a bigger flower and leaf set for next year. That's beneficial for the trees. And then lastly, as they finish mating, after mating is done and they've laid their eggs, they start to die and their carcasses start to collect at the base of trees. And get some warm July temperatures and some rain, they'll start to rot. And it is a scent memory. You will not forget that smell. And that rotting tells you that indeed the cicadas are decaying. And as they decay, the nutrients in their bodies go and form a nutrient cache around that tree. And so if cicadas died out entirely tomorrow, we'll still have eastern deciduous forests in North America. However, the forest and the other animals that live in the forest benefit from these pulses that occur during periodical cicada emergences.
Great, thank you. We have time for maybe one quick question, and this will be the last question. And if for those of you who we didn't get a chance to get to your question, I will give an email address where you can reach us, and we will happily follow up with you after the program to answer all the unanswered questions. So the last question tonight is about that fungus. Dr. Kritsky, do both females and males get infected with the fungus? And I know the percentage, again, if you could remind us of the percentage and how it affects behavior. And if you ate one that had the fungus, would it be dangerous to eat?
Well, I like cicadas. I like cicadas too much to encourage people to eat them. They got me tenure, so they've been very good to my career. But yes, the fungus does affect females. In fact, it is spread from the male to female cicadas through mating. I know this because I've actually dissected out the spermatheca of females and found in many cases hundreds of germinating fungal spores in the spermatheca. So they can get the fungus. If someone would to try to eat these, I wouldn't advise it. There's an amphetamine and there's a psilocybin in there, but it's in such low quantities it wouldn't. I wouldn't encourage people to go out there and try to find infected cicadas and suck out the powder from their abdomen. And lastly, the numbers that I've done census for infected cicadas, and the infection rates can be up to 30%. However, if they're a infected male or female, they oftentimes don't get high enough in the trees. They tend to collect on smaller plants near the surface. So when you're doing a surface count, counting up the number of infected cicadas, that's a bias. It's going to give a number that's higher than it probably really is.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Kritsky. You helped answer so many questions, and I think people really enjoyed your presentation tonight. I just want to remind you, if we didn't get to your question, please email askaneducator@lcfpd.org. I'm putting that in the chat right now. We've got a lot of upcoming cicada programs, so I did send a link to our website, so please visit the website for all the upcoming cicada programs, including an exhibit at the Dunn Museum that Dr. Kritsky helped write a lot of the content that's in that Celebrating Cicadas exhibit at the Dunn Museum in Libertyville. And it's been a pleasure. So thank you so much, Dr. Kritsky, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Gene.